Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Montesquieu Forum. We have been having events, conferences, and lectures for 14 years now, and this is the third occasion in which we will be having a lecture on a film. Previously, we've had a lecture on Blade Runner, the final cut. And we've also had a lecture on Miller's Crossing. This is the third time. We could not have picked a more propitious date than October 3rd. Because in one of the most important films of the 20th century, Mean Girls, early in the film, Aaron is sitting in front of Katie, and he turns, two very well chosen names, and he turns back to her, and as Katie puts it, it was October 3rd when he asked me the date. She was thrilled this was her life. Today is October 3rd. So welcome. Our speaker today is Professor Samuel Zeitlin. Professor Zeitlin received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley in 2018. He's published broadly a wide array of subjects. If one had to put a finger on his single area of expertise, to the extent that that's possible, it would be the late 16th, early 17th century philosopher Francis Bacon. And indeed, Professor Zeitlin is putting the finishing touches on a book called War and Peace in the Political Thought of Bacon. He's published many essays on Bacon, essays connected to Thomas Hobbes. He has translated, I believe it's 4 volumes of the writings of Carl Schmitt, which seems to be appropriate given his lecture today. He has shown himself to be a superb translator and also a superb thinker. And I, for one, look forward to this book on Bacon. Currently, he's a lecturer in history and politics at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge University. This particular year, he's visiting professor in political science at Colgate University in Hamilton, New York, and this is why we are fortunate to have him. Before having him stand in front of the podium, I wanted to read a passage that's actually from a book that was the subject for a Montesquieu Forum lecture in the spring. And that's Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. And in Invisible Cities, Marco Polo visits Kublai Khan to report on various cities that he claims to have encountered. And at the end of this, the end of these 55 cities that Marco Polo presents, Kublai Khan says, it's all useless. If the last landing place can only be the infernal city, and it is there that, in ever narrowing circles, the current is drawing us. To this, Marco Polo responds, the inferno of the living is not something that will be. If there is one, it is what is already here. The inferno where we live every day that we form by being together. There are 2 ways to escape suffering it. The first is easy for many. Accept the inferno and become such a part of it that you can no longer see it. The second is risky demands constant vigilance and apprehension. Seek and learn to recognize who and what, in the midst of the inferno, are not inferno. Then make them endure. Give them space. Such an individual is Professor Samuel Zeitlin, and we are here to give him space. Please join me in welcoming him to the Montesquieu Forum.
Thank you, Stuart, for that tremendously generous introduction. I wanted to thank Professor Stuart Warner and Professor Zarminkov for the great invitation to speak before the Montesquieu Forum, within a distinguished series, and before this distinguished group. Philosophy at Roosevelt is distinguished by being the only philosophy department in the English-speaking world where I esteem and respect every single member of the faculty of the philosophy department and their scholarship in the highest degree. That, unfortunately, cannot be said of the philosophy department at the University of Cambridge, but is a testimony to Roosevelt as a university, that through excellent hiring and excellent teaching, excellent scholarship, they may boast and they should boast of two great teachers and scholars in philosophy. That fact has also made me somewhat nervous and anxious speaking before this group. Because I was anxious about lowering the standard of the talks in this series, I asked Professor Warner what I might do so as not to disappoint this group with this talk. Just one thing, Professor Warner replied. Don't be a verkachte Tuchis. Yet, also, in preparing this talk, I had the occasion to look over Colin Higgins's writing on Harold and Maude, which I had heard was being viewed and assigned in the philosophy of film course here at Roosevelt this semester. In the novelization of the screenplay for Harold and Maude, Maude tells Harold that everyone has a right to be precisely what Professor Warner told me that I ought not to be. Quote, everyone, the character Maude asserts, has a right to be an ass. End quote. So we have two potentially distinct opinions on a related question. The question of Professor Warner, the opinion of Professor Warner, on the one hand, Professor Warner, on what one ought and what one ought not to be, and the opinion of the character Maude on what everyone has a right to be. So are the opinions in tension with one another? Are they irreconcilable opinions? Aware of Maude's claim about rights, one aims to follow Professor Warner's injunction about the good, with the recognition that one may not succeed or may fall short of the good. To chart a map of this talk, I will offer first a narrative reading of the opening of the movie The Counterfeiters, directed by Stefan Ruzowitzky. Then I will give a second reading of the opening of the movie, comparing the movie to its source material. Following the comparison of the movie with its source material, I will then offer some reflections, political and otherwise, on the meaning or significance of the comparison, and then I'll conclude the talk. The title of this talk is In Framing the Historical on Stefan Ruzowitzky's The Counterfeiters, Die Fälscher. Germanophone cinema about the Shoah is inframed by a gestural language of silence. At the end of Jakob der Lügner, Jacob the Liar, the sole East German entry to receive a nomination for Best Foreign Language Film at the Academy Awards across the whole history of the DDR, the German Democratic Republic, the film ends with a sweeping pan up and out of the camera from the entrained villagers staring out of the window of a cattle car up into the clouds of a brightened sky. The gesture of a pan away from the living into the sky and into the clouds is endlessly repeated and reiterated in Germanophone cinema about the Shoah. Stefan Ruzowitzky's film from 2007, which won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film at the Oscars that year, opens with a reversal of this trope. the camera pans down from the gray blue sky to light upon the shore. A lone man in a black suit and fedora sits upon the shore, staring out to sea. A French periodical cast away upon the beach informs the viewer and the man upon the shore that, quote, the war is over. La guerre est finie. The man upon the shore stands up and ascends from the shore to the skyline, and as he walks past street vendors selling silverware and streetwalkers evading soldierly advances, to the music of Argentine tango, to the harmonica of Hugo Diaz, the man picks up his briefcase and begins his ascent. To the music of the tango, the lone man in the fedora ascends above the skyline and to the Hotel de Paris. As he enters the grand lobby of the hotel, the bellhops and concierge greet the man as Monsieur Sorovitch, and the concierge informs the man that, quote, we must regrettably ask you for a deposit. Sorovitch opens a briefcase filled with stacks of American dollar bills and hands a stack of them across the hotel desk. $200 suffices, the concierge replies, handing back most of the dollar stack. Sorovitch is then seen unloading the remainder of the stacked dollars into a safety deposit box elsewhere. Quote, is this your first time in Monte Carlo? The bank guard asks Sorovitch. Sorovitch is silent and does not answer. Throughout, Sorovitch says nothing. He speaks through his gestures. Sorovitch has been reduced to silence. This Sorovitch is a man who stares at the ceiling. Between the ceiling and the floor, Sorovitch catches sight of a silk-robed and anonymous figure, whom the film script refers to solely as the girl in the casino, Mädchen im Casino, played by Dolores Chaplin, the actress granddaughter of the lead of the great dictator. In a Monte Carlo casino, Sorovitch takes to the card tables, where he takes all the chips and the girl. The viewer almost imagines Sorovitch to be a newfangled James Bond, a role reversal of the novel version of Ian Fleming's debut, Casino Royale, from 1953, where the survivor is a villain. The camera cuts to Sorovitch's hotel room, where the woman from the casino tackles Sorovitch on his hotel bed, only to come up against the numbers tattooed onto his left arm, a parallel scene to that in Harold and Maude, in which we learn that Maude is not best understood solely as being Countess Matilda. What's this? The woman asks Sorovitch in French. Qu'est-ce que c'est ça? In French accented German, the Dolores Chaplin character asks, you were not in a concentration camp, only to find herself ashamed at her own question. Sorovitch is silent, heavy in his respirations. The white-blue light fades to the gray bright of morning. The morning after, as the woman dresses to leave, she notices that Sorovitch has placed money within her belongings. Quote, I'm not the woman from the casino protests. Sorovitch gestures for her to take the money anyway, which she does. Sorovitch is silent. Wearing shades in his fedora, staring out at the sea, Sorovitch is served champagne upon the patio of the Hotel de Paris. The camera pans into the back of a waiter in a cut similar to the loop cuts from Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, which often go into the backs of characters. Emerging from the rope cut and the waiter's back, the viewer finds another champagne service in a darkened room of a cafe or kneipe or club in what could be late Weimar Berlin. Here, Sorovitch is a man about town. It is 9 years earlier, in Berlin in 1936. Everyone wants something from him, his money, his wine, loans not to be repaid. 2 Nazi party members approach Sorovitch, one with accompaniment. Quote, Sorovitch, seien Sie Russe? Hoffentlich gar kein Kommunist. Sorovitch, are you a Russian? Hopefully not a communist. the friend on the arm of the second Nazi asks, laughing. Enough of a communist to share my champagne with you, Sorvich responds, filling the glasses with wine. Sally, was für eine komische Name, what for a comical name, what for a strange, foreign name. The woman walks away when she hears that Sally is an abbreviation for Salomon. She can spit out the champagne. It's a Rothschild champagne, Sorvich retorts, as the woman walks off with the wine. Up in Sorvich's artist's atelier, he has packed his bags. Sorvich has stayed in one place too long. Two acquaintances have come to him for passport forgeries, for passports to escape Germany for Argentina. The pair lack sufficient money to pay Sorvich's fee for the forgeries. Sorvich's male acquaintance asks for a free passport forgery out of ethnic solidarity. Quote, "These are our people," he tells Sorvich. "Don't you know what the Germans are doing to us?" "I am me and the others are the others," Sorvich responds. "Don't you see what's going on around you?" his acquaintance asks. Sorvich replies, "Do you know why the Jews are always persecuted?" Sorvich harshly retorts in answer, "Weil sie sich nicht anpassen. Weil sie sich nicht anpassen, es ist nicht so schwer." Because they don't accommodate, this is Sorvich's response, they don't pass, Sorvich responds. It's not that hard. The key word for Sorvich before he is reduced to silence by the mass of his experiences is Anpassung, passing, accommodation, assimilation. One accommodates, one passes, one assimilates, or it's over. Quote, "Man passt sich an or man geht drauf," the Sorvich character says to Berger in one of the middle scenes in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp barracks. One passes into the role, one assimilates, or it's over. One gives up, one goes up to the chimneys, to death. The ideal of passing, of accommodating, when held as a social ideal, knows or sees no internal boundaries or limits. Anpassung is the ideal away from which Sorvich is silenced in the trajectory of the film. Sorvich tangos with the client for whom he forges an Argentinian passport, again to the tango music of Hugo Díaz's harmonica. Argentina, Sorvich says, home of the tango. Sorvich engrafts his client's picture upon the cardstock of an extant passport, painting and brushing the stamp marks onto the engrafted image. What Sorvich does to the passports, placing new pictures on old cardstock, the film's director, Stefan Ruzowitzky, and the film's editor and cinematographer, Britta Nader and Benedikt Neuenfels, respectively, due to the images passing before the eyes of the viewer. Sorvich mounts one image upon another, and it is part of what is visually distinctive, what really marks the film. What's visually distinctive about Die Fälscher as a film, that a number of the scenes set in the Mauthausen concentration camp, that the actors were filmed against blue screen, which was replaced with external photography, blue screen, external photography of the concentration camp itself, Mauthausen in Austria, which still exists as a physical place, and as it stood then in the early and mid-2000s. The action of the actors is set against photography of the camp itself, giving the film the feeling, and the feel and texture of verisimilitude and veracity. This technique is deployed in the early scenes of Sorvich as a painter of the portraits of the concentration camp guards and personnel, gefällt mir, in KZ Mauthausen. Sorvich awakens in the morning after the drawing, and in the morning after, having drawn and vetted the client for whom he forged the Argentine passport, he awakens to his own arrest. Friedrich Herzog of the counterfeiting department of the Berlin police arrests Sorvich, saying that, quote, "It is an honor to have the privilege of arresting the best counterfeiter in the world." The criminal is moved from prison to concentration camp, and we see Sorvich again in 1939, being marched from prison into the concentration camp Mauthausen, then again in 1944, when he and other prisoners are cattle trained to concentration camp Sachsenhausen and tasked with doing the impossible. They are to counterfeit the pound and then the dollar, or be shot. Jean-Jacques Rousseau says somewhere that his books merit being read twice. once from the beginning, and once more, once one has a picture of the whole. Let us look again at the opening of the Counterfeiters, at the opening of Die Fälscher. Packed into trains like cattle, a group of exceptional prisoners deboard their train cars and are marched into an horrific camp in the middle of the Second World War. Death surrounds the camp. The corpses of inmates and their unmarked final resting places greet the new prisoners as they are marched in, and alongside scenes of camp guards beating the inmates, which we see, alongside those scenes are thrust before the eyes of the viewer and the cinematic audience. The commandant of the camp announces the arrival of the new inmates before all the inmates assembled. To aid the war efforts of their captors, the camp commander and warden inform them the newly detained are given a supremely difficult task, the fulfillment of which may momentarily ease the suffering of the inmates, but will greatly advance the martial and material plans and prospects of the Axis powers, hindering Allied efforts to win and finish the war. Quote, "You prisoners have been chosen," the camp adjutant informs the prisoners in the camp. "If you work hard, you will be treated well. But if you do not work hard, you will be punished," with the threat of death more than implied. The movie described is not solely the Counterfeiters, Die Fälscher. It's the bridge on the River Kwai. Updated at 50 years distance, it's the bridge on the River Kwai. Updated at 50 years distance, the role of Colonel Nicholson, for which Alec Guinness won the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1957, is given over to Salomon Sorovich as the prisoner charged with leading the inmates on their impossible mission. Hauptsturmführer Herzog replaces Colonel Saito as the camp commander. The role of Commander Shears, played by William Holden, who advocates resistance, delay, and escape from the camp, is taken up by Adolf Berger, played by August Diehl. Even the inmate doctor, Dr. Klinger in The Counterfeiters, finds his doppelganger in Major Clipton, played by James Donald in David Lean's masterpiece. Quote, "You're a fine doctor, Clipton, but you've a lot to learn about the army." Only the sadistic concentration camp guard, Hauptschnarrführer Holst, played by Martin Grambach, in The Counterfeiters, finds no character equivalent in The Bridge on the River Kwai. Holst is wooden. The wooden sadist stands in for all the Nazis whom the Jewish survivor Berger wished to name, and which the Austrian film producers forbade. How should we think about historical fiction? Is the fictional element of historical fiction a scalar property? Could you mark the fiction of historical fiction on a scale? Is it a kind of scalar variable? Can we think of historical fictions as being more or less fictional? If we were to set two more or less contemporaneously constructed, non-identical historical fictions of the Second World War next to one another side by side, may we say that one of them is more fictional than the other? May we say that one of them is more historical than the other? Can we say that Die Fälscher, The Counterfeiters, for example, is more or less fictional than the Germanophone films with which it is contemporary, say Downfall, Untergang, or Sophie Scholl, Die letzten Tage, The Last Days of Sophie Scholl? Can we say that Die Fälscher, The Counterfeiters, is more or less fictional than Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds? In one sense, Inglourious Basterds ends in a way that no Holocaust film has ended, and in a way in which no Germanophone Holocaust film produced before, say, 2025 could end. It ends with the branding of the Nazi perpetrator. As in historical fiction, is Die Fälscher more or less fictional than Inglourious Basterds? At first glance, we might say Die Fälscher is less fictional. Hitler was not assassinated by Jewish insurgents or Jewish members of the American army in the manner of a revenge tragedy by Webster, in the way that this transpires in Tarantino's 2009 masterpiece. Yet, Inglourious Basterds has no source material other than historical fictions films about the Second World War. Inglourious Basterds is, in this sense, more fictional than the works of fiction whose fiction it augments. The Counterfeiters, however, does have source material other than historical fiction. Indeed, the movie presents itself as precisely based on this material, as based upon the testimony of an exemplary survivor of Adolf Berger in his 1997 memoir, Des Teufels Werkstatt, the Devil's Workstation, the workshop of the devil. Is the fictionalization of fiction, or the fictionalization from fiction, more or less fictional than fictionalizing from fact, than fictionalizing from the testimony of survivors? If the real architecture of the plot, the characters, and the narrative structure of the movie, The Counterfeiters, is given by other films about prison life during the Second World War, above all by The Bridge on the River Kwai, what we might ask is The Counterfeiters precisely not based on? Here, the film's ostensible source material might be nominated as a candidate. Adolf Berger's Des Teufels Werkstatt, The Devil's Workshop, which both the film itself and, above all, the film's publicity claim as the work's basis. Stefan Ruzowitzky, the director of The Counterfeiters, is also credited as the author of the film's screenplay, freely adapted from, frei nach dem Erlebnisbericht, adapted from Adolf Berger's memoir. What are the senses, in what senses might we think about free adaptation? A free adaptation might be free in multiple senses of the word free. A free adaptation might be free in the sense of being based upon material from which the adaptation deviates in minute or minor regards. In this sense, a free adaptation might be a freely based adaptation. Yet, a free adaptation might also be free in the sense of being closer to fully abandoning, directly contradicting, inverting, and subverting its source material. In this sense, a free adaptation might be thought of as a kind of free-from adaptation. Examples of a freely based adaptation, so one actually grounded in but deviating from its source material, might include the film version of Oliver Stone's Alexander from 2004, based upon Robert Lane Fox's Alexander the Great, for which Robert Lane Fox was a script consultant. Or in a literary register, Gettysburg, as an adaptation of The Killer Angels, or David Fincher's film version of Fight Club, nearly every line of which takes its basis from the Palahniuk novel of the same name. Or for the Shakespeareans, I hear that there are Shakespeareans in the audience. For the Shakespeareans in the audience, Kenneth Branagh's 1996 adaptation of Hamlet, which aims, through very rapid speaking, to drop no line of the original Shakespearean verse. By contrast, a free-from adaptation might look more like Spike Jonze's adaptation, most loosely based on Susan Orlean's The Orchid Thief, or Jean-Luc Godard's 1980s film version of King Lear, which, unlike Branagh's Hamlet, includes almost no line of Shakespearean verse. The adaptation of Berger's memoir by Ruzowitzky is closer to being a free-from rather than a freely based adaptation of its source material. The Counterfeiters, the movie, is closer to Spike Jonze and Charlie Kaufman's approach to Susan Orlean's work than it is to Oliver Stone's approach to Robert Lane Fox's work in Alexander. Ruzowitzky's Die Fälscher has more in common with the Shakespeare of Godard than it does with the Shakespeare of Branagh. Adolf Berger, in his memoir, focalizes Nazi selections within the memoir as part of the sheer arbitrariness of the machinery of the Nazi death camps. Selections are present from the very beginning of the book in the dedication, to which we shall later return, through nearly every chapter of Berger's memoir. As a master craftsman, Berger is interested in how handmade paper is manufactured, in the ways in which one identifies the security features of banknotes. Cartography is an eye of Clio, the muse of history, and Berger's memoir is chock full of maps, graphs, tables. Berger is keen to document the floor plans and architectural design of concentration camps, the layout of the stables, the bunkers, the crematoria, the gas chambers, and the barbed wire fences, images and maps of which he prints within his book. Berger's memoir resounds with a plurality of voices. He tells his own story and that of his family. Berger relays the testimonials of other survivors, and he prints these too as documentary evidence. As corroborating evidence, Berger quotes from the speeches of Himmler and of Slovakian allies of the Nazis, advocating the deportation and extermination of Jews in public in the period, loudly and for all to hear. Berger blocks out quotations from Rudolf Höss, the Nazi commander at Auschwitz from 1940 to 1943. Berger is interested in deportation statistics, in Nazi profit margin calculations, in the ways in which German corporations like Siemens, Krupp, and IG Farben profited from slave labor in the camps in collaboration with the Nazi state. Berger is concerned to document the amount of dental gold, extracted from victims of the Shoah, which the Nazi state shipped to Switzerland to finance its war efforts. Berger prints statistical tables and charts to evidence each of these facets of Nazi death machinery. In all of these ways, Berger's memoir has the feel of a kind of homemade collage, and in the brief bibliography at the end of the book, the work cites the author's personal archive amongst its sources. And yet above all, Berger is keen to name names. Berger lists out in his appendices, but also throughout the book, Berger lists out the names of the concentration camp guards whose brutality, murder, war crimes, and atrocities he witnessed, their post-war occupations, and their lack of criminal accountability under Nazi amnesty laws of the German Federal Republic. Berger wants to point out the Nazi war criminals, and he wants to call them by their names. At the outset of the radio program, and later the television program, Dragnet, as the viewer stares at the haloed sergeant's badge of the Los Angeles Police Department, the narrator intones, quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to hear is true. Only the names have been changed to protect the innocent." In Dragnet, the names have been changed to protect the innocent. In The Counterfeiters, the names have been changed. All historical fiction involves a counterfeit, involves falsification. The Counterfeiters is an historical fiction of the Holocaust, which thematizes its own falsification. The film's producers are doing to history what the inmates portrayed in the film are doing to the dollar and the pound. The Counterfeiters is a film about Operation Bernhard, the Nazi counterfeiting operation, which cannot say Bernhard because that is the name of the SS commander in charge of the operation. Bernhard Krüger has become Hauptsturmführer Herzog. Bernhard Krüger has been changed to Friedrich Herzog. Adolf Berger's book begins with a Brecht citation and a dedication to his wife, murdered in a selection at Auschwitz in 1942, and his memoir ends with an appendix listing the names of the SS guards and Nazi officers who supervised the Sachsenhausen forgery operation, including the years of their birth and the place of their origin, where they were born. More than a few of these individuals were still alive in 1997, when the first edition of The Devil's Workstation appeared in German, and indeed when the film The Counterfeiters appeared a decade later. In a medial transfer in media from a written work to a theatrical film, omissions are almost inevitable. One would struggle to name any filmic adaptation of a memoir, historical, or literary work which omits nothing from its source material. And yet what is not inevitable are direct errors of commission, which reverse the event's trajectory, plot, and aims of the author of the literary work, memoir, or history. Omitting the names of the Nazi war criminals, which had been central to Berger's endeavor of memory and of accusation in his memoir, depolemicizes the work in the adaptation. In what other ways, we might ask, does The Counterfeiters overtly falsify Berger's memorialization of his experience of the Shoah? The film explicitly avows a direct falsification only of the dates of closure the dates of the closure of the forgery operation, and of the mode of the liberation of the prisoners. But it does actually avow that it is falsifying this. Quote, "The Counterfeiters is a free working over of the factual report, The Devil's Workstation, by the former concentration camp prisoner Adolf Berger. The film attests in written German, in the acknowledgement sections in the credits, in minute 98, if you have the DVD, minute 98 of the run of the film. Quote, the inmates of the forgery station were, including the machines," and the text says this, "brought into the concentration camp Mauthausen in March of 1945, and later to Ebensee, where they were freed on 6 May 1945 by American troops," end quote. So that's a block quote from the text of the credits. Sachsenhausen was not Sobibor. Sachsenhausen was not liberated by concentration camp prisoners themselves, as the film presents the concentration camp being so liberated. In presenting the dissolution of the camp as an auto-emancipation by the concentration camp inmates, the fiction inflates the exhausted strength of the survivors at the end of their torture. The fiction downplays the culminatory death marches and brutal cruelty of the Nazis at the end. And the fiction demotes the Allied war efforts in ending, with all too many delays, the Nazi regime. If the prisoners themselves liberate the camp, as they do in the film, the Americans, the British, and the Soviets within the film do not. Near the end of the film, under cover of darkness, after the Nazis have abandoned the concentration camp Sachsenhausen, where the forged money was produced, the camp commander and leader of the operation, Herzog, in place of Kruger, returns to collect the forged bills for himself. Solomon Sorovich catches Herzog in the act, knocks him to the ground, and holds the SS officer at gunpoint, noting in a stunning reversal that the SS officer has urinated upon himself, which the SS officers had done to Sorovich himself in some of the most shocking scenes of the film. Sorovich, perhaps holding that it is better to suffer than to commit ill, lets the SS commandant go. In history, Solomon Smolyanov, the real-life basis of the character of Sorovich, did not hold Bernhard Kruger at gunpoint, and he did not let him go. In the film, Sorovich is a kind of Jewish hero who tangos on the shore and who doesn't pull the trigger on the SS officer clearly in his sights. Of this, there is nothing in Adolf Berger's memoir. Solomon Sorovich is whatever the film's producers, with the financial support of the Austrian state, need Sorovich to be. Sorovich is the hero Germanophone cinema wants or feels itself to need, even if Sorovich is not the hero which the Germanophone states deserve. Throughout the second half of the film, the delaying tactics of the inmates on forging the dollar, although known to the SS slavers, go unpunished. In Berger's memoir, by contrast, a prisoner in the forgery unit who takes a single note of forged currency to his own belongings is given a lethal injection into his heart by an SS doctor for the crime of sabotage. Each of the reversals of Berger's narrative gives the Jewish inmates more power over their situation than they historically had in the concentration camps. If more situational power implies more situational responsibility, the implicature of the film's reworking of the memoir becomes obvious. Each of the reversals implies that the Jewish inmates had more power over, and thereby were more responsible for, their fate than in historical fact they were. No less, each of the reversals also portrays the Nazi war criminals as more lenient than they were, and thus as less meritorious for the retribution which the film's hero, Solomon Sorovich, declines to enact upon them. Each of the narrative reversals presents escape and sabotage as more possible than they were in reality, and than they were as that reality is related in Berger's memoir. Not least, Berger dedicates his memoir at the very opening of his book. He dedicates his memoir at the very outset to his wife, murdered in Auschwitz in the gas chambers when an SS doctor selected her from a lineup. The book is, quote, gewidmet meiner Frau, Gisela Berger, bei einer Selektion im Dezember 1942 von einem SS-Arzt mit einer Fingerbewegung zur Ermordung in die Gaskammer geschickt. Dieses Buch wurde geschrieben, damit nie vergessen werde, was geschah. Berger's memoir is dedicated to my wife, Gisela Berger, sent to be murdered in the gas chambers by a movement of the finger by an SS doctor in December of 1942. This book was written so that what occurred may never be forgotten. The film, The Counterfeiters, in the film, presents Berger as receiving a letter from the SS and from Auschwitz explaining that Berger's wife has died in attempting to escape the camp and was shot doing so. No such letter service existed for prisoners to receive news of the fates of their loved ones, and no such fate was received by Berger's wife. The Counterfeiters, the film, does not forget or omit Berger's wife's death. It erases the mode of her death, death by selection for the gas chambers, and presents attempted escape from Auschwitz as more possible, more plausible than it was in history, and more possible than it was in the film's putative source material. As the opening of The Counterfeiters, just like the works of Rousseau, might be read twice, so too does the film end twice. In the concentration camp, when first offered a game of cards with Adolf Berger, Salomon Sorovich claims that he wins at cards even when he does not deceive. He wins even when he doesn't cheat. Back in the post-war present, in the casino in Monte Carlo in 1945, Sorovich holds 4 aces, and he folds with a winning hand. Emptying the forged dollars from the safe deposit box, Sorovich throws them randomly on the roulette table of the casino, intentionally losing it all. The casino management offers Sorovich complimentary champagne on the house as he descends to the darkened shore on which the film began, with the Jewish forger staring out to sea. Quote, "You had bad luck," the silk-gowned woman says to Sorovich as she sits down beside him upon the shore where the film began. "So much money, so viel Geld," the silk-gowned woman says twice as she and Sorovich begin to tango on the shore in the blue light of dawn. "Wir können uns Neues machen," Sorovich replies. "We could make ourselves some more," as the tangoed harmonica of Hugo Diaz floats into the ears of the audience. No one knows whether Salomon Sorovich or his original, Salomon Smolyanov, liked to tangle and to tango upon the shore. There are no tangos in The Devil's Workstation by Adolf Berger. In the credits, in the acknowledgments, the film ends for the second time. Quote, "We thank Adolf Berger for his inexhaustible help in the completion of this film," end quote, the film's producers write. The Forgers, The Counterfeiters ends as it began, with a double counterfeit, a double falsification, a double forgery. Thank you. I take questions if there are questions, or objections, or counter proposals.
Yeah, I love the analysis and the argument. I just had a question about the author and the source material. I understand that he was alive when the film came out. Did he have anything to say about these changes from his?
Right. So there are interviews with him at the end. He doesn't praise the film. Right. He doesn't praise the film at all in the interviews with him. If you watch the DVD, and he even gives the details which undercut the thematic presentation. But the book was reissued, so the book was reissued both in German. So this is the reissue. This is the 2006 reissue, which is before the film. The earlier version of the book is 1997, and it then occasioned more attention to the book, right? And he was also paid to. It allowed him to share the story. So I guess it did raise, as it were, consciousness about his story, but indirectly. And I think, and insofar as the film does draw our attention to the book, I think the book merits our attention. But I think we should also think about what the film is doing and how it's changing the book. And does that speak to your question? Or that, yeah.
If I recall correctly, the film ends with a little blurb that says the delay by the prisoners of the counterfeiting was important. It was important that they
I wanted to just make a comparison. So I just wanted to draw a comparison. And also just to highlight the ways in which the movie differs from its sensible source material, and just raise the question. So I don't know about the question of what the people in the camps. I don't think I know enough. I also wasn't. I can't judge. I don't know. But so the other question is kind of historical counterfactual. But Berger does treat a lot of the post-war period in the book and in the memoir. So what happened to the dollars? What happened to the forged currency? He's also interested in the collection of the currency, and he has charts. And the question is, you would need an economic historian to assess that. I mean, you need an economic historian to actually assess the question of what the forged currency did.
Does Berger confirm that he tried to delay the success of the program?
So he does not, and that's actually something that both comes up in Berger's own. So he doesn't speak about that in his commentary on the DVD, but the director's commentary marks that actually Berger in the book, but also it's true, that's a correct thing that Ruzowitzky says, that Berger is more like Sorovich, actually. So, and he's portrayed as different in the movie, but he's a survivalist. So one of the things that Berger does actually is he has himself classified as non-Jewish to survive in Auschwitz. Right? So, I mean, and how does one, but he has one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent, and he goes to the SS in Auschwitz, or this is how he presents himself as doing it in the memoir, and has them write to his non-Jewish mother so that she write a letter, so he'd be classified as a Slovakian political prisoner rather than as a Jew, so that precisely to avoid selection, which if you're a non-Jewish political prisoner in the concentration camp, you don't have to stand nude before the SS doctors and be chosen for random gassings, which is how his wife died. So that's a serious survival. So both in the memoir he fronts at the very beginning, he says, I was born to a Jewish family, right? But the mode of survival, it actually comes up in the movie. So there's a dialogue in the movie between Sorovich and Berger. And Sorovich asks Berger, how did you survive in Auschwitz for so long? Right? And the character dodges it. And that's an allusion so in the ways in which this goes back to the very first good question, both good questions are excellent. So it goes back to the first question in the sense of there are places in the movie where you're directed back into the source material. And insofar as that is the case, I think that's how we should be thinking about that, I think. But the moral and ethical question, I think, is do you have a thought, or?
Beyond what I said, that maybe they didn't have enough agency as prisoners to actually confront the dilemma that the movie places them in.
Right. I think that's the implication of the talk. Yeah. So I think that thought, I think that's something I wanted to suggest.
Curious about the image you started with. Maybe I was struck by how Solovich is constantly looking up, both at the beginning, which you mentioned and described beautifully, and then all throughout his time in the camp. Even when he's talking to an SS guard, regardless of his position, whether he's face to face, below him, physically, or across the room, he's always looking up. I wonder what you make of that going beyond the opening sequence and into the film, and what that means for how the film.
And also in enclosed spaces, right? But I suppose, if he's looking up, he's looking away. So I guess there's an avoidance of eye contact, which can be confrontational. But it's also you would think about it as a meeting of the exposed parts of the brain. So a meeting of souls in the sense we're meeting of minds. So an avoidance of that. But then you also avoid disclosing your thoughts unconsciously to those you're discussing with. In the opening part, you could think about it as also kind of shell shock. Also, when she sees the numbers, you hear the sound, which is the metallic sound, which you'll later hear when he's in the shock sequences. So it calls back this metallic sound. But I'm not sure. What do you make of the?
I found it striking, and I have to wonder whether the scenes of him at the beginning, where he's always looking up, if that's a character trait that he acquired in the camps, or whether that was his response before the experience, and the fact that we see what happens after, before we see his experience in the camps,
guess the comparison point would be the scenes, kind of both in the Kneipe or the cabaret, in the brief kind of late Weimar, early Nazi periods, 1936 moment. Is he looking up there? I don't think he is. I mean, he's in those points, he's actually looking the people in the eye, right? And in those, he's a free person up until the moment that he's imprisoned for forgery. And so maybe you only see the upward look after the imprisonment. So it's pretty direct. I mean, he confronts the person who owes him money in the kind of cabaret scenes. He confronts also the woman who wants to suggest, seien Sie Russe, are you Russian? Was für eine komische Name? That's a strange name, a stranger's name, but implicitly also a Jewish name. But he then says, spit out the Rothschild champagne, or but so it's more direct, more confrontational. Maybe the learned behavior of imprisonment is not that. Other questions?
I'm interested in the political aspect, political commentary aspect of the film, which seems, haven't read the memoir, so I'm wondering if there's any of the sort of, most of the characters seem to be like Sally and want to pass, and they talk about, we have to protect ourselves and each other, but there are a couple characters, there's the dedicated Nazi, there's the dedicated communist and Berger, and then there's the dedicated liberal, like the banker who says, I'm an honest man, and is forced into forgery. So I'm wondering if that is connected with the thesis on sort of assigning more agency to the characters than the historical persons would have had, that these kind of political debates and complete anachronisms of like the liberal pretending that he's still a respected member of society, things like that.
And so the character who's the banker also both the SS officers and the criminals laugh at him. The person who is true to the rule of law. You could think of it as a kind of Kelsenian figure potentially, but also someone who's loyal to the state, right? Who's a good citizen, and that there are there are situations in which being a good citizen is what counts socially as being a good person, but there are situations where those things come apart. I don't know if that speaks to the question, if there are other aspects of the thought.
Yeah, it just with I was wondering if that has any relation to things that were in the memoir, or if that's also a sort of an invention of the.
Right. So I guess it relates to the question from your neighbor, two persons to the right. That those questions are related. So the fact that Berger himself is also implicitly a master of en passant, even more than Sorevich, right? Sorevich doesn't petition to be declared non-Jewish from the Nazi state. That's actually, in a way, in reality, Berger outstrips the Sorevich or Smolyanov in en passant, but it's it's necessary to survive. I don't know if that.
I'm wondering, in light of these changes between the memoir and film, if you could speak a little bit more about this directorial palimpsest of like the layering of the documentary footage of actual locations with the fictive filmic narrative, because I'm fascinated by that. So I don't really have a super coherent or concrete question there. I just wonder if you could reflect on that a little bit more in terms of these same kinds of themes of the distance between authenticity and quote unquote, the fictive, and this kind of combination of the two of them.
So you could say a non-fictive element that I think is actually powerful about the film. It's an Austrian film. It shows Austrian concentration camps, right? So it shows Mauthausen, right? Which not all Austrian films. There are Austrian writers, speakers who say we're not part of this, right? So it is a kind of intervention that they show Mauthausen, but the concentration camp itself wouldn't allow the filmmakers to film the film in the camp. And something that comes up on the directorial commentary, but also in other publicity aspects of the film. But then they use this aspect that then mirrors Smolyanov or Sorovich's own passport forgery. And so there is this kind of reflectivity about what they're doing. But then that actually forces us, precisely because they're being reflective about the forgery or about the alteration of the past, forced to think about all the ways in which they're doing that. And that, more than anything else, or arbitrating the question of responsibility, that was what the talk aimed to show. I don't know if that speaks to the thought.
Terrific. I just have two things I'd like you to comment on. First, I wonder if the deepest level of counterfeiting on film is by the characters who attempt to make their lives prior to the concentration camp real in the concentration camp. So I have in mind two characters, Victor Hahn, who when we first see him is behind what looks like a teller's cage. It looks like the bars. And it's at that point that he castigates Ali for being a criminal. So it looks as if he wants to counterfeit the life outside inside. Connected to that is Dr. Klinger, who says more times than I could possibly stomach, I've seen lots of these people. I'm a doctor of internal medicine. Over and over and over again, as if he's creating some kind of fantasia. Right? So it's this profound, it's this taking what can only truly exist outside and trying to make it exist inside. So counterfeiting reality. So I wonder what you think about that.
So, yes, so but you can ask again, you can come back. So on Klinger, this relates to Professor Tarkov's good decipherment of the film as based structurally on the version of Requai, as discussed. So Klinger has a corresponding fictive presence in David Lean's masterpiece, which is Clifton. Right? And you can think about Klinger and Clifton as setting up a comparison between Sorovich and the Alleghenists, Colonel Nicholson. Right? The one thing that would differentiate the characters is that Colonel Nicholson conscripts the sickbay to work on the bridge of Requai, whereas Sorovich keeps the tubercular figures in sickbay, tries his best to conceal them, to counterfeit them by actually even cutting his own finger and rubbing his blood, to basically give life to the flesh. And actually, that's in a way, in fact, you find yourself rooting if you're watching the film for the first time. It's just you're rooting for the concentration camp inmates, but you're also rooting. But then in doing so, you're actually rooting for the Nazi war machine, just as in rooting for the very charismatic Colonel Nicholson, you end up actually rooting for the Japanese Imperial Army to construct its bridge. But it's a kind of self-overcoming, even if you're identifying with the prisoners. But in effect, the figure of Sorovich and the figure of the concentration camp inmates actually serve to demote the British and to demote the Allied war effort. So there's a way in which Klinger and Clifton serve to accentuate different aspects of Nicholson and Sorovich. On Hahn, I think Hahn is one of the characters that does not have a corresponding figure in the bridge on the Requai. And it raises the question of, ideals of citizenship, ideals of the rule of law. So the basis of Sorovich, Smolyanov, so part of why he's, at least what he's classified as being in jail for, is being a criminal who can't be re-educated, an irredeemable criminal in some sense. I mean, also, in effect, for being Jewish, but the line, so it raises the question of Anpassung, the limits of Anpassung, the limits of assimilation, the limits of, pretending to be what you're not, or trying to fit in, the limits of trying to fit in. That is raised with Hahn. So that's something that actually embraces fitting in even more. So it's actually an accentuation of aspects of Sorovich. Actually, I don't know. What do you think about that? It's actually Sorovich's ideal taken to its ridiculous extreme. I don't know.
Well, no, that's fine. Let me get to the second half. I wonder if we could see Giselaberger's death as being encoded in the penultimate scene of the film. I'm struck by the differences between the beginning and the end, that the end involves roulette. And if I remember correctly, there's no roulette at the beginning. And when I think of roulette, I think of two things. I think of something mechanical, and I think of something that's simultaneously a matter of luck. Right? So she's chosen So I wonder if one might see it as contained.
No, that's great. I mean, the comparison is great. But I think that would be a perfect reading if it had not already been discussed. Right? If Berger hadn't received the letter in the concentration camp, which is utterly fictive and unnecessary, right? And in a sense also cruel from the vantage of Ruzowitzky to the then living Berger, right? It effaces his dedication to his memoir, right?
Do you think a question. Do you think Sorovich is transformed in the film? Do you think when he's urinated on, that this is, to use a pun, a bridge too far? And that what he might have done previously, he's not willing to do, because it looks as if he could have forged the American dollars anytime. Looks as if he didn't really need Berger. And it's only after being humiliated or shamed in this way.
And he was trying to do it before. I mean, so even in the earliest scene when they enter his atelier, there's the bar of the dollar, which then Herzog picks up in the arrest. He says, that was a bridge too far, as it were, or you were biting off more than you could chew, Herzog says. But so the parallel, with being the humiliation scene has a parallel in Herzog or Kruger's own humiliation, which is that when Sorovich or Smolyanov holds him at gunpoint, which is also utterly fictive, that Sorovich reports that Sie haben sich angepisst. So that's what Sorovich says. So that's a kind of maybe narrative parallelism within the film, but neither of those two things are in the book. Have I spoken to the question or thought?
I mean, it's probably just a repetition of other questions, but this, so he's a master technician. It's more clear in the movie than in the source material. The sort of superior, whereas the other way maybe. I don't know.
So Smolyanov almost doesn't appear. It's only 2 pages, and one of the things. So this the kind of collage aspect. If you had to draw out so the collage aspect of the book is Berger prints the arrest notices for Smolyanov. So he's interested in this obsessive archival documentation. So showing via. So it's on page 160 in the German. It's the same in both. So he prints drawings. So he prints Sorovich's self-portrait, but he also prints the criminal photos of Sorovich when Sorovich is arrested. He prints the criminal reports. So it's the Kriminalurkunde. So it's a kind of police report on Sorovich when Sorovich is convicted and when he's tried. So Berger really wants to show it's kind of documentary. So you could say it's a source memoir almost, a collage almost. And so you kind of see that many pages and even some chapters. If you have a 10-page chapter, you maybe have text on 4 pages or 3 pages. So he really wants to show from his own archive, his own clippings, his own newspaper clippings, it really happened, right? And one of the things he clips is a 1973 advertisement from German war veterans offering a 10,000 Deutschmark prize or 10,000 Deutschmark reward for any Jew who comes forward who does not, in cross-examination, impeach himself or impair his testimony by cross-examination for that person to speak and actually prove the gas chambers. And so in fact, he's actually offering himself for the prize. Just like you could imagine, I mean, in a different way, it may be a different way, but just like Rousseau in the first discourse, right? But he's actually saying, look, I can show it. I can show it, and it's also obsessed. It's a kind of obsession with it. And the book itself is actually answering the call of the German war veterans who were Holocaust deniers. But I missed
What then about the film, because this Rousseauian theme about morality and science, does Sorovich find a limit to techne? So he faces something like a moral question. I mean, urinated on, you could say that's something about dignity which he cannot think through by his virtuosity. And then something about the apple, I'm not sure that's related. I'm not sure what this apple is. It's a very striking scene. Perhaps the apple is just hungry, but some apple.
So when he's painting the portrait of the first SS guard, when he's in Mauthausen the first time, so it's like the 39 scenes, he steals the apple then.
Yes. Was that the half-eaten apple?
That's the half-eaten apple. It's in like the first. It's around the first 20 minutes of the movie. So it's circa between minute 20, minute 25.
Right. I mean, so, the desire to sabotage the Nazis can be understood technically. You want to survive, so you're going to sabotage the Nazis. You need to be a kind of master at lying as well. But this lie about the gelatin, of course, it's completely transparent. The Nazis know very well. You can't keep saying the gelatin isn't working. And so that's, but you need to have a master technical thought analysis of the situation. One way of putting it, is it possible to have a technical analysis of the human soul, or does he reach a kind of limit to this? I mean, it's also, I think, related to, does he want to get rid of the money because bad money, and he has a moral objection to it? In general, yeah, what is
So on the technique question, so the memoir, so things in the movie that are attributed to Sorovich, which is, for example, realizing that the pound paper is built out of deconstructed rags. That is attributed to Sorovich in the movie. In the memoir, the rags are the finding of Nazi laboratories. Right? So in other words, Nazi technical expertise is attributed over to the Jewish forger. Right? So, and I think and this goes back to that question about responsibility. It's attributing, and so I think it does fit a larger pattern, irrespective of what one should think about, what one should do in that situation. Is it more responsibility is being ascribed to the inmates in the movie than in fact, or in the memoir on which the movie is ostensibly based? And it's more that claim that I want to show or share in this talk. But I don't, and I think that does relate to the technique claim, right? In other words, Sorovich is presented as more of a technical master, a wizard, really, which only a laboratory could figure out. But he holds it up. It's almost like an aha moment from the rags. He perceives it just from bare eyesight.
He certainly is more of a great hero, and that's more of a real master that does everything right in a certain way, which they must find some limit to it. Well, I mean, there's another part. Yeah, so he says he never ran out. What seems to be a moment of stagnation and difficulty is you can't rat out the easiest thing to do is to rat out Burger, so we can, now whether that's correct, maybe they'll be killed anyway as soon as they manufacture it. We have some ways that we make the money that we don't need us anymore. Right, but then he somehow does it right on time, but maybe this chance.
I guess it's also to avoid, there's this kind of, there's a scene where it's, if they don't produce it by that time, certain, at least, some, not large quantities, but some quantity, then 4 or 5 fellow inmates will be immediately shot. And then it will, that the same will be reiterated again and again until such time as they have perfected the forgery, even if they haven't perfected it in quantity.
Yeah, I mean, just been mulling things over. I just don't know if there's a reflection that makes sense that he achieves or not. Maybe it's just chance. He seems to be mulling over this dilemma, and because the action works out for him, I wonder if it means that he does use his brain and artistic skill to figure out the moral dilemma by technical means. Probably not.
Right, but I'm not sure I know. I don't know. I don't know how to begin to tackle thought. But it's what do you think? I mean,
I just don't know if it's possible. There's some things that you run into, like classical philosophy and Farabi, that there's the arts, and then there's the noble is a matter of opinion, the arts. And he said just that the arts are a different sphere and have nothing to say about the noble. And can you apply the arts to the noble and get a more reasonable way of thinking about not ratting out your inmates or
and which parts, or what would be the thesis that you see emerging from the movie or from reflection on the movie that would speak to that question of classical political philosophy?
Yeah, and how when he decides to make
So the limits, I guess the limits as portrayed in the film of that. So I guess the film ascribes to Sorovich much more than the memoir does. Sorovich only really figures on 2 pages. Has it's one little chapter, and that the 2 pages include his criminal report and the kind of profile pictures of him in a lineup. So it's kind of drawn out. It's a moment from the memoir that is actually, and it actually in a way devours the whole thing. And I guess also in offsetting Berger, I mean, it's also from the perspective of the Berger is also a member of the Communist Party. He favors Soviet rule. These things are uncomfortable for West German and Austrian film producers. So those things have to, in a sense, are played down. I mean, even if his Berger's will to resist is played up, and him as a saboteur, that's played up, but that's absent in a way. And I guess it also, but it does reflect back on those political questions. But I think so. The amount of responsibility, or about also the technical facility ascribed to Smolyanov or Sorovich, is more than it is in the ostensible source base. And again, but I don't know if I can arbitrate the question of a kind of master thinker, right? Who can through brilliance, you could think that there are Socratic aspects of Sorovich. I mean, I guess one would be implicitly, it's better to suffer injustice than to commit it, right? So there is something of that kind of Socratic image in the movie, right? So that Sorovich refrains from the violence, enacting the violence on Herzog that he has received.
But more Thucydidean. What I was asking, maybe it's more Thucydidean.
But you could think about Sorovich as saying, well, it's odd. It goes back to also this question about Hahn, the 2 questions about Hahn, that Sorovich is the criminal who is really the kind of Socratic just man in some sense, even though he's forging things and breaking all kinds of laws, but he doesn't do the kind of injustice that the Nazis do to him, even to the Nazis themselves, at least as presented in the movie.
I just read in Wikipedia that he became a forger of icons. He moves up.
But he also the historical reports about this figures also that he forged passports for entry into the then mandate in Palestine, and that's dropped from the movie. So that's another topic that is uncomfortable, perhaps, for the Austrian film producers and German film producers. So that aspect of it. So he forges passports to get people to Argentina, but after the war, he doesn't just toss all the money at Monte Carlo. He also forges passports for entry into Mandate Palestine. So he has the Anpassung position that's articulated in the film is not the position of the historical Smolyanov enacted in the aftermath of the Second World War.
Initially, it seems like if you can forge money, it would be sex and champagne. So there's a kind of, even though it's neutral, there's a kind of tendency that it's low level hedonism. But then you say some moral consideration guides the use of technology upward for experience.
Yeah, because then he abandons the view. Perhaps you could see him in the education of Smolyanov, the education of Sorovich Smolyanov, if you combine the historical figure. So if you were to reinsert the historical fact, which is absent, you would have him moving potentially away from the claim that, which we have in the, say, first act of the movie, that, warum sind die Juden immer verfolgt? That's the question that, weil sie nicht anpassen. Es ist nicht so schwer. That's what he says, and that I think he abandons that position. I think both the historical Smolyanov abandons that position if he ever had it, but the filmic character does abandon that position without adopting some other position in the trajectory of the film. And am I speaking to your